Hey everybody, how's it going? My name is Charlie and welcome back to another episode of Why Advocate. Now, if you aren't aware, Why Advocate is a podcast series and also a capstone project of mine that highlights the works of student advocates and what they're doing to make their communities a better place and to bring attention to important issues that students are facing on a daily basis. Today, I'm going to be talking with my dear friend and colleague at OUSA, Alyssa Hall. Alyssa is a former Brock University student and she now works at Brock University Student Union as the Vice President of External Affairs. All right, welcome back everybody. I am now with Alyssa. Alyssa, how are you doing today?
I am great. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really good, thank you. So, to start off the podcast, I think I'd just ask you quickly, who is Alyssa?
So I was born and raised in Sarnia, Ontario, and then I moved to St. Catharines to start studying at Brock University, and I just graduated from Brock with a combined major in gender studies and political science. Now I'm currently working for the Brock University Students Union as their Vice President of External Affairs. But a little bit more on the personal side, I guess, of the introduction. I am a crafty person, so I love making things with my hands. I've been into jewelry making lately, so that's what I'm working on now. And yeah, that's me.
So I think, well, just for a little bit of background about myself too, I go to Brock University as well, and I actually had the privilege of going to OUSA with Alyssa back in the fall. Alyssa, maybe as like a question to start about your advocacy journey, maybe I could ask you, one, what got you into advocacy at Brock University and with OUSA? And second, how have you found the experience so far?
So I guess my advocacy journey started formally in my fourth year when I took on the role of OUSA's research and policy writer. And so in this position, I was part of the advocacy team at the student union and was able to work with the director of advocacy as well as our vice president of university affairs last year. And so one thing that really drew me to this position was the ability to advocate for students through some of the policy writing that I was doing. I had been able to publish a policy paper with OUSA actually focusing on student ancillary and incidental fees, specifically how some of the high costs of these fees contributed to a barrier to participation for students in the post-secondary education sector. And yeah.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. I know our topic of discussion today is affordability. So I guess as a nice segue into the policy paper that you wrote, what would you describe the current situation is right now? A student living, in 2023, a student who's going to university, what are some of the struggles that students face when it comes to affordability? Yeah, we'll start off with that.
So in terms of the struggles that students are facing with affordability, I think it's first and foremost important to mention that students are affected by affordability in different ways depending on their socioeconomic background, their racial background, their gender identity, sexual identity, and a lot of those identifying characteristics such as that. So the impacts of affordability, although it's affecting the majority, if not all of our students, it's affecting them in different ways. So I think that's something that's really important to recognize. Another thing on the affordability piece is that affordability in terms of post-secondary education and how you can participate within this institution, it's something that's all-encompassing as well as multifaceted and multi-layered. I think when people are hearing about affordability of post-secondary education, they immediately jump to the high prices of tuition as well as ancillary and incidental fees, and obviously those are extremely high for our students and disproportionately burdens a lot of low-income students and acts as a barrier to participation within this institution in the first place. But affordability also encompasses things such as the high cost of housing, the high cost of food, clothing and materials that you need to participate within these different classroom settings, and just the cost of living crisis that people in Ontario in general are experiencing is also impacting someone's ability to participate within the post-secondary sector. And so I think these are all barriers that need to be addressed, albeit there's going to be different strategies to address each. but it's something that is really needs to be considered.
So we talked about affordability in general. We talked about the cost of education, that it is very high for students. Let's go more deeper into that in a way. Let's talk about food challenges. What are some things that you're seeing, in your own institution at Brock University? What are some of the challenges that students are facing when it comes to getting a good meal?
I think some of the food, first and foremost, food insecurity for students attending Brock University is a really rising problem, and it's only unfortunately getting worse, especially as the cost of groceries continues to increase. So there's a couple layered to this, I guess, in terms of allowing students having access to healthy meals that are going to allow them to participate fully within their education in completing that. So the first piece, something that we're trying to do to help some of the food insecurity being experienced by our students, is we have the Food First program that the student union runs. So in this program, I believe students either once or twice a semester are eligible to receive a $40 gift card to a grocery store, which would allow them to purchase food for however long that $40 lasts them. That being said, we recognize that $40, especially with the rising price of groceries, is not going to get you very far, especially if you're trying to purchase foods that are healthy and that have the nutrients that you need to give you the brain power again to keep continuing your schoolwork. So we are looking at opportunities to partner and create some food banks on campus for students that would allow them, again, the freedom of still picking the food that they need to eat. And it would also be reflective of some dietary restrictions that are happening, as well as some cultural considerations in terms of food need as well. So that's one piece that we're trying to do to help with some of that food insecurity. The other piece, and I've mentioned it a few times already, I think, is the food that is available to students isn't necessarily healthy food. It's stuff that's really quick and easy to grab and go on their way to classes, to eat in between classes. And so that's an issue that needs to be addressed. And I was having a conversation with someone the other day, and we talked about how almost eating disorders and disordered eating for students is something that's become normalized, and it's something that's seen as just part of the student life in general. It's really easy as a student to say, okay, I can skip breakfast today because I have this early class I need to get to, and then they don't necessarily eat anything until their lunch or dinner. And that culture around food has just become normalized, which is something that needs to be addressed as well. And I think that ties into the high cost of groceries, is if we're normalizing students not eating properly nutritious meals however many times a day that their body needs to function normally, it ties into the part about not being able to afford that food in the first place.
The Food First program, I think it's a really good initiative that Brock University is taking on, and I think it's the first step in addressing the issues that students face when it comes to food insecurity. So good on the student union for doing that. So I think...
Sorry, can I just add something really
Absolutely,
quick too? This ties back into affordability, but our Food First program, I'm not 100% sure how much funding is allocated to that program each semester. That being said, I know that last year, the money that was used towards purchasing these gift cards for the students, because the need was so great, it doubled in just one semester what it was actually what the funding for it was allocated for in our budget. So it just shows that the need is super duper great, and it's something that's only continuing to rise. And it would have been interesting to see those numbers had we not had to unfortunately limit the amount of eligibility and the amount of gift cards someone could access in a semester, just based on the high need that our students on campus are experiencing with this, with food insecurity.
Can you tell me a little bit about the housing issue that students are faced with, both on campus living and even off campus living? Can you tell me some issues students are facing regarding that.
So a lot of the work of BUSU's executive team this year in terms of our advocacy, we've been really fortunate to meet with some of our municipal representatives, and we've continued our advocacy for the creation of more housing that is safe, affordable, and accessible for students. So in that, there's a few different layers for some of the needs for housing that students have been coming to us with. One of the things that we're most concerned with here and that our students have expressed concern over is some of the exploitation that they experience in terms of housing. Specifically, there is no rental cap for student housing, and there are some bylaws that limit the amount of people who can live in one single house or dwelling. That being said, they're not always as strongly enforced when we're seeing students who are crammed into a single family home and there's 5, 6, 7 people living in that space, in bedrooms that are barely big enough to fit their bed in, and they're being charged super duper high rental prices, which in and of itself is a problem, and that's leaving them vulnerable. So the high rental prices is an issue that needs to be addressed, but also the people who are renting to a lot of our students. As the majority of our students are young people, they're living away from home for the first time. They're increasingly vulnerable to falling victim to what I would refer to as a slumlord, where they're signing lease agreements that may not be fully legal just based off of the fact that they don't necessarily know what their rights as tenants are, and so they end up signing an agreement that puts them in a bad position. With slumlords being in charge of the rental property, students are open to exploitation in terms of lease agreements that aren't entirely up to snuff in terms of following the Landlord-Tenant Act exactly as it should be, and because students don't necessarily know what their rights as tenants are, they are more easily victimized in these situations. And I think it's worth noting too that our international students are particularly vulnerable to this instance happening in the first place. There might be a language barrier, there might be a cultural barrier. They haven't lived in Ontario for long enough to know what their rights as tenants are. So I think it's worth noting that that population is increasingly vulnerable to being victimized and exploited when it comes to renting. Another issue that we're finding is because it's increasingly less expensive to live off campus as opposed to on campus, most students flock to these off-campus housing options, especially our low-income students, because it is more affordable to live in some of these spaces. That being said, there might be a bunch of more students living in there that necessarily the house was initially designed to hold in the first place. So the environments that they're living in aren't necessarily conducive to the study and living environments that they need in order to be successful students. And this would contribute to some of the mental health challenges that they're experiencing. It would contribute to some roommate disagreements and potentially create a hostile living environment if it were to go to the extreme. So that's an issue that would need to be addressed as well. And just in general, rental prices are through the roof. It's not something that just students are experiencing. Young families are experiencing the same thing, in which they can't afford to live and rent in the spaces that they need to in order to participate as active community members. And because of some of the challenges with renting, our students might be taking a full-time course load, and then they might also be working full-time, and so that limits the amount of free time that they have, because they need to do this in order to afford to live and survive in some of these spaces. A third challenge to housing that some of our students have come to us with is the feeling that they feel disconnected from the wider Niagara community. Oftentimes student housing is centralized in these pockets of all student housing, which disconnects them from the rest of the community members and creates more of a rift between permanent residents of the Niagara community and students who may only be living here for a few years at a time. And so we've been actively working in order to try and change the narrative and ensure that permanent residents of Niagara are looking at students as the valuable and valued community members that they are, just to help our students feel more connected to the Niagara region and feel like they are more of a part of the community.
What makes you passionate specifically about student affordability, and why did you decide to author that paper? What's your calling to it?
So my interest in affordability advocacy started actually outside of the post-secondary sector when I was working as a caseworker at Ontario Works. So Ontario Works provides some financial social assistance to low-income individuals and families living throughout Ontario. And as part of this job, I was tasked with completing outcome plan reviews for different clients. And so an outcome plan is essentially just the goal that the clients have of where they are now and the goals that they want to set in order to get to where they want to be in the long run. So through some of these conversations with clients, when I was conducting these outcome plan reviews, a lot of individuals expressed that they did want to go into work in a specialized sector. The problem with that being, though, is they needed some form of education in order to do so, that with the current income that they were getting being on Ontario Works, coupled with OSAP, which has reduced the funding that it's giving to students, they felt that financing that education was a major barrier to just pursuing that in the first place and taking the first step in order to enter a post-secondary institution of any way, shape, or form. And so recognizing that as a barrier for the clients that I was talking with, and then coming in to my role as a research and policy writer for BUSU last year, the ancillary paper wasn't one that I had necessarily picked. It was one that the steering committee member last year had picked as their interest to write on, and in my role I was helping them in doing that. But through the research that I was doing on the ancillary and incidental fee paper, a lot of the challenges that the clients I was speaking with at Ontario Works were experiencing were some of this very similar to the challenges that students were experiencing through my research and consultation process. And so this helped me realize that affordability for just life in general, not even focusing specifically on the post-secondary sector, is an issue that a lot of Ontarians are experiencing. And again, they're experiencing it in different ways depending on their background and depending on what goals they are trying to achieve. But it's something that a lot of people are struggling with right now, and it's really unfortunate to see.
It is, and I think just you coming with that outside experience, working at Ontario Works, working for the government, and seeing, you had your own clients coming up to you and telling you that they, some people can't even go to post-secondary schooling because it's just too expensive. I think that's an issue that we need to address, and that, students like you are addressing. I want to talk to you a little bit more about yourself. I want to ask you, well, this is more of a general question, I guess. So can you tell me about how you got into BUSU and what pushed you to become a student leader in that way, and what pushed you to become the current VP of of the student union? Which, congratulations, by the way. I don't think I congratulated you about that on the podcast yet. So
thank you. I guess my route into working for BUSU, sorry, there's a fly buzzing.
It's okay.
My route into working for BUSU as a student leader, I started late during my educational career. So I didn't really start getting involved with BUSU until I was in my fourth year. And during that time, during that time of my fourth year, I was working as the research and policy writer, and my year as the research and policy writer looked a little different than it had typically in current years, just due to some of the my role as a research and policy writer looked a little different than it had in past years. in the sense that I was given the opportunity to do a lot of cool experiences, many of which happened with OUSA in general. So I was first and foremost able to author a paper, which I was really happy about, and getting some more of that writing experience. I was also able to attend their student advocacy conference, where I was able to lobby members of the Ontario government on different issues that were being experienced by students at my home institution, as well as those of other OUSA member schools. So that was a really interesting experience, and it was actually some of the conversations that I was having at the student advocacy conference that led me to applying for my role of the VP of External Affairs at BUSU in the first place. After that week in Toronto, I realized that this was something I did want to do full-time and on a more permanent basis, and the VP of External Affairs role gave me that opportunity to do so and to continue to build on some of my advocacy skills on behalf of the Brock students that I was hired to represent. So I think that's my favorite experience so far. I know I'm only a month and a half into the job, so I'm very, very new still, and I've still got a lot to go and a lot to learn. But what really drives the work that I've been doing so far is the recognition that I'm here on behalf of Brock students, and I want to do justice in how I'm representing them, and making sure that their voices are being heard in the places where decisions are being made. So I'm really thankful to have been given this opportunity in the first place.
How would you encourage students to become a voice for others, and what is the best way for students to get involved in advocacy?
I think the first step to being a voice for others is to first and foremost listen. And it's important to create and foster safer environments where students feel that their opinions and voices and concerns matter in those spaces, and where they feel that they can express themselves in an open, honest, and authentic way. I think listening is very important, and not just listening for the purpose of wanting to respond or for the purpose of suiting your own agenda, but actively listening and taking in what is being said to you. In this role and the external advocacy that I've been doing so far, I am here first and foremost to represent Brock students. I'm not here to represent my own opinion. I was hired to make sure that the voices of Brock students were being heard and being represented in the different levels of Ontario's governance system. So listening is a first very important step. And for those individuals who do want to get involved in advocacy moving forward, whether that be at their post-secondary institution or somewhere else in the community, I think it's really important to go and talk to other community leaders first, to find people who inspire you, whose work inspires you, and to not necessarily follow in their footsteps, but build a sort of mentorship role where you can ask questions and learn how to best be a good advocate, and to make sure that in your advocacy work, you're being authentic to the people you're advocating on behalf of. I also recognize that in this position, I have been given a position of privilege where I am able to enter some of the spaces where students have historically been excluded from. And so again, making sure that students know I'm on their side when I'm in these spaces, and I'm there to represent them. I'm not there to represent me. And I just want to make sure, again, that student voices are being heard in the places where decisions are being made, because I think the student voice is an important one, and it's one that deserves a seat at any table. And I've reiterated this a few different ways in some of the projects I've done, but I'm going to make sure that Brock students have a seat at that table, even if I am bringing my own folding chair to those spaces. I think it's important that students' voices not only need to be heard, but they deserve to be heard.
Awesome. Yeah, that is such a great response. And I think, for our listeners watching this, I would take notes from Alyssa. Really, like the great points you bring up. And, if you are a student and you have an issue that, concerns you, OUSA, we do a blog where you can write about any student issue, any issue that you are facing or you see others facing in your community. It's a great way to kind of, I guess, open up yourself in a way to comment on some things that you are concerned about as a student in ways for others to hear about and to learn about. And I think that's a really good point you bring up, Alyssa, is about being a good advocate, is about being able to listen and to take notes of what, you know, the consensus is, what students are facing, with the issues that are challenging to them. So thank you for that answer. One final question for you. And this is a BUSU related question because, again, you are the Brock University Student Union Vice President of External Affairs. What goals do you have for BUSU this year? What are some things that you're wanting to address? And is there any way this ties into affordability?
So I guess there's a few different goals that I had this year, and the biggest one for me was getting students more involved in the advocacy process. In this position, I've been fortunate enough to be given the opportunity to work on some of BUSU's internal policies and setting some of those priorities a little bit more, as well as have also been given the opportunity to go and have some of the meetings with different government stakeholders in the community. And so I want to make sure that students feel that they're being represented through the work that I'm doing, and making sure that they're getting involved in these processes. So giving students a forum where they can voice their opinions and concerns, that's something that's still in the works for me, and it's not been finalized yet, but it is a major goal for me, is to get students more involved again, and to just be aware of the advocacy work that we're doing for them as their student union and as their representatives this year. In terms of the advocacy piece, me and the advocacy team have set our priorities for the year, and I'm happy to say that the big ones that we're focusing on are food insecurity for students on campus, and mental health specifically, but just student health and wellness in general is another priority for us. And we're always continuing our advocacy on affordability as well, specifically related to housing affordability for students on and off campus, and making sure that those spaces are safe, affordable, and accessible for all students who wish to live in those spaces during their time at Brock.
I want to say thank you, Alyssa, for coming on to the show and giving your insight on student affordability and what it means to be an advocate. So thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for having me and for giving me the platform to talk about some of these issues that students are experiencing.
Awesome. Okay. Have a good one. Bye, guys.